So here we are, chapter 9, on respiration. The caption says, "Fortunately for Sparky, Zeke knew the famous Rex maneuver." Of course, respiration in biology and, respiration in biology and breathing are not quite the same thing. So that is respiration, but that's not really the respiration we're going to be talking about. We have talked about it before, though. There are a bunch of different types of respiration, but as we often do, we look at ours as one type and all the other ones as the other type. So our type of respiration uses oxygen to pull fuel molecules apart and move that energy into ATP. That's aerobic respiration. And then we lump everything that doesn't use oxygen together as anaerobic. There's a bunch of different types, but they all don't use oxygen, so the term does fit. It's just, there's not just one anaerobic respiration. The molecules that we use are basically anything where carbons are stuck to other carbons and we can pull them apart. But the food chains, the ecosystems, are primarily based on glucose. Glucose being a molecule built by taking energy out of the environment and using that energy to stick carbons together in a little sugar molecule. Now, we talked early on, first chapter, about a couple of ways to do that. There's chemosynthesis that we'll talk about later in the chapter a little bit. That's where the energy from the environment is essentially heat. We talked in the last chapter about how heat is involved in making particles move and bopping them together. And it's an easier to use energy to knock carbons together than light. But of course, photosynthesis is the primary type of synthesis in the world, mostly because you need an awful lot of heat for chemosynthesis, and there's not a lot of ecosystems where that much heat is available. Mostly hydrothermal vents, cracks in the bottom of the ocean where new ocean floor is being made, and the hot magma from underneath is mixing with the water and forming lots of hydro water thermal hot vents. And that's the type of heat that's used in chemosynthesis. We've also talked about the levels here. The producers, the things that take the energy from the environment, lose some of it as heat, but make chemical energy out of it, move the energy from the light into the carbon bonds, and then everything else is consumers, and of course the heat kind of fritters off from them as well. So tracking the energy coming in and heat, which is really coming out everywhere. You've got energy being used to, package into chemicals in producers, and they basically supply the rest of the chain. The consumers and the decomposers, which are just a special type of consumer that helps to recycle all the materials. But what happens to the energy is that by the time you get to here, you're breaking all the carbons back apart and using what energy is there, and the leftover is coming out as heat. So, like I said before, you got to have this light on all the time because the way that entropy works, the only way for this system to stay going is if there's energy coming in the front end, because there's energy frittering out everywhere. Now we are going to start by talking about anaerobic respiration. Later in the chapter, we'll talk about the very beginnings of life on the planet. And at those periods, there was very little free oxygen available. Until the plants started to crank it out, there never was oxygen, remember, is very reactive. It's around, but it tends to be locked up with other things. So the early life, in order to get any energy out of the environment and any energy out of molecules, had to pull it apart without using oxygen to do it. So anaerobic respiration was kind of the original respirations, and a whole bunch of different ways were worked out to pull different chemical compounds in and use them to pull carbons apart. So we're going to talk not too much about the chemistry of it, but we are going to talk about how this impacts us. That's supposed to be an H. A lot of what varies from one type of anaerobic respiration to the next is when you start to pull the fuel molecules apart, how far do you get? With aerobic respiration, you get all the carbons separate. You wind up with carbon dioxide, lots of carbon dioxides. With a lot of anaerobes, you get combinations of different chemical compounds, including ethyl alcohol. Ethyl alcohol is a 2-carbon molecule, and we use fermentation to produce alcohol for things that we drink, also for things that we use as an antiseptic, right? It's a lot of the hand sanitizers and other sorts of things have ethyl alcohol in it. Is that it's fairly reactive, and a lot of living things don't like it, but a lot of living things actually produce it. And so the ethyl alcohol in beer is produced by anaerobic yeast. The ethyl alcohol in wine is produced by anaerobic bacteria. What also winds up being produced is the baker's yeast that we mix our dough in, and we give them some nice warmth and some moisture, and then throw them into the flour. They start to break down the carbohydrates in the flour, and they do a type of anaerobic respiration that produces a little bit of ethyl alcohol, which evaporates pretty easily because it is warm, and a lot of carbon dioxide, and that forms the bubbles that makes the dough rise. Some fermentation processes, like the ones for beer or for champagne, also produce enough carbon dioxide to make bubbles. Sometimes you do, sometimes you don't. Depends on the type of anaerobic respiration going on. There's a lot of anaerobic organisms used in production of dairy products. Yogurt, cheeses, when you buy milk, milk has been pasteurized. It's been treated with heat to kill the bacteria, except it hasn't killed all the bacteria. There's a type of bacteria that's in milk that is pretty heat resistant. You have to really heat the hell out of it in order to kill it. And when you do that, it changes the nature of the milk. So for a long time, they just kind of, we pasteurized, you get the milk. If you leave the milk long enough, the bacteria that are still in it will take the lactose, the milk sugar, and break it down, and they will produce lactic acid, also produced in cheeses, to some extent in yogurts. And the lactic acid is what makes the milk go sour. Now, over the course of the last 40 years, they've come up with what they call ultra pasteurization, which is a way to kind of flash heat the milk so that it doesn't kind of make the milk go nasty, but it kills that last type of bacterium. So there's nothing in the milk when you buy it to make it go sour. That gives it a much, much longer shelf life. Um, in some cases, they actually hit the milk with heavy radiation and kill the bacteria that way. That kills everything. That gives you the type of milk that you can leave on a shelf. Don't even need to refrigerate it. And you can leave it there for months. But a lot of dairy applications, both bad, milk souring, and good, what gives flavors to cheeses and odors to some extent, the probiotics that are in yogurt, those are all anaerobic organisms. Speaking of probiotics, the microbiome is a term that is, for science, is fairly new term. And it was originally applied to all the little buggers that live in our colon, in our large intestine, our intestinal symbionts. And actually, there's a symbiont is an organism in a relationship with another species where they both get something from it. And there's a bunch of those that live in our colon where we give them a nice low oxygen place to live that's pretty protected and there's food available and they do something for us. But the microbiome also includes a whole bunch, there's like 1,200 different species of bacteria that live in our colons, and we don't know what most of them are doing. Maybe they're useful, maybe they're just there. They're not hurting us, so they're not parasites, but they may not necessarily be doing us a great favor. And this term is starting to expand because we have bacteria and other sorts of animals and plants have bacteria and other types of microbes doing all sorts of things. So there's a skin microbiome. There's a question now about whether natural delivery and transferring the vaginal microbiome to the baby during delivery gives it some benefit over cesarean section where you don't deliver them that way. But that's another microbiome that people talk about. Okay, what sort of symbionts? We knew for a long time that there were digestive symbionts in our colon. They mobilize iron. Iron is not easy to dissolve in our blood, and so they fiddle with it so that it dissolves in the blood. They take a material from our food and convert it into the actual coenzyme vitamin K. So I don't know that is it really a vitamin if they're making it for us and we're not making anyway. What they've discovered in the last 20 years or so is that there's a whole bunch of bacteria and possibly viruses in the colon that interact with our immune systems and actually help to train our immune systems to react to other invaders. That if your microbiome is messed up, your immune system can be messed up. It may be when you attack your own tissues that there may be some interaction with your own microbiome that's gone a little wonky. So this is a big new area of exploration for a lot of biologists, and stuff's going to keep coming out of this. I don't know if you've ever heard of a fecal transplant where you clear somebody out and then you transfer in poop from another person to swap out their microbiome for somebody who's healthier, but that is actually a thing. And of course, they're microbes, so you go, well, wow, they got to be associated with diseases, right? Well, yes and no. Yes, some of them are associated with diseases of your colon. Salmonella gets in there, doesn't play well with your own microbiome, and that can mess you up. But the rest of your body, there's not a lot of places where there's not oxygen. So these things don't tend to be that invasive. I'll give you one example, tetanus. You get a puncture wound in a fairly thick part of your skin. And there's a bacterium that lives in the soil. It's a soil bacterium. It isn't really interested in living in you, but you just gave it an opportunity. And if it settles in a spot that's far enough away from the oxygen at the surface and far enough away from the oxygen in your blood that it's a pretty low oxygen environment. Doesn't have to be no oxygen, but a low oxygen environment. It will sit there and reproduce. It's stuck there though, is it can't really go anywhere because it winds up in a higher oxygen environment than it can tolerate. But those bacteria produce a very nasty metabolic product, a toxin, and that's what gives you tetanus. That's what gives you lockjaw. It gets into the machinery of your muscles and locks them up, and can paralyze your breathing system and do all sorts of nasty things to you. And in fact, when they give you a shot, they're actually giving what's in the vaccine. It's actually a vaccine, is the toxin molecule just twisted enough that it isn't a toxin, but the part that your antibodies will be formed against they will also fit on the actual toxin. And once they're on the toxin can't hurt you anymore. So you generate antibodies to the tetanus toxin by being exposed to the tetanus toxoid. Boy, this is really making my tongue have fun. And that's the purpose of tetanus shots. Turns out that the immunity does wane. Is some things your immune system does, it'll just keep doing forever. And some things it kind of at some point loses interest or loses the ability. That's one of the big questions about the coronavirus vaccines, is how long will they last before you need another vaccination to up your immune response. The indications are that if you've had it, that the immunity is long-lasting. It's relative that was an outbreak in Korea 17 years ago. Those people are still immune. So anyway, so that's probably a good place to pause this, and then we'll move into aerobic respiration for the next video.